this coming Monday. Yeah, if we don't have any other announcements, let me get to introducing our speaker for today. So our speaker for today, Dr. Maria Kristina S. Gallego, is an assistant professor in the Department of Linguistics at the University of the Philippines. She recently earned her PhD degree at the School of Culture, History, and Language at the Australian National University. Her current research is on the documentation of the Ibatan, a language spoken in Babuyan Claro. She has presented and published various papers on language, contact, and change, focusing on the Austronesian languages of the Philippines and Taiwan. The talk today is very fitting with her research, and I hope that all of us, I know that there are some people interested in the Austronesian migration will be paying attention. So, without further ado, Dr. Gallego.
First of all, maraming salamat for inviting me to give this lecture or seminar. I'm very freshly graduated, so December 2022, and this research is one chapter of my thesis, but actually like the meat of my thesis. So it concerns reconstructing the social linguistic history of the Babuyan Claro community. So if you don't know where Babuyan Claro is, you will know a bit later. So I'd like to begin my seminar by emphasizing how the Philippines is a linguistically diverse country. So it has about 187 languages, and most of the communities are multilingual. So where we see individual and community level patterns of multilingualism, meaning how people use their different languages. I think most of us here are multilingual. We can speak Filipino, English, and then for some of us, we can speak like a local language or even a regional language. So all these patterns of language use are argued to facilitate what we call contact-induced language change. So essentially, it is ongoing cross-linguistic influence, how the different languages in our repertoire, in our speech as bilinguals, these are what can potentially become deeper contact-induced language change. So the big questions of my PhD were first on actuation, how bilinguals use their languages and how innovations arise from their speech. And this is very synchronic, like very transitional. And then on transition, how these synchronic variations among bilinguals transcend into community level change. That is, these changes become more regularized. And then on reconstruction, so how insights from our ongoing language use can be used to reconstruct the social history of the community. So in this case, Babuyan Claro. And this is what I will be demonstrating in this seminar, specifically who the agents of language change were throughout the history of the Babuyan Claro community. So to guide us through the flow of the presentation, I will first talk about the linguistic landscape of Babuyan Claro and then introduce a framework for studying language contact and change. And then I will be presenting selected data, which I argue constitute layers of change in the Ibatan language. So in this presentation, one thing to note is that I will be presenting bits and pieces of data from various domains, so from phonology, morphology, and so quite a wide breadth, but these will all come together in the last bit of the presentation. So before I go to the main part, I know that everyone here has limited linguistic knowledge, so I will try to keep my presentation accessible, but there will be parts that will be a bit technical. I'll try to explain in a very simple way. So please bear with me. Okay, so the Babuyan Claro community, which is the focus of my entire PhD project, is located here. So the small island here, where Ibatan is the local language. So Ibatan, not to be confused with Ivatan of Batanes, is closely related to the Batanic languages of Ibatay and Isamorong of Batanes, and then you have Itbayaten of Itbayat Batanes, and then there's one language called Yami or Tao spoken in Orchid Island, which belongs administratively to Taiwan. So this small group comprise the Batanic languages of the Philippines. But administratively, Babuyan Claro belongs to the Babuyan group of islands of in Cagayan, where Calayan here, this island here, is the municipal center. And in the Babuyan group of islands, except for Babuyan Claro, Ilokano is the main lingua franca. So for the residents of the other islands, they use Ilocano as their first language. And so the Ibatan people are also very proficient, and they learn Ilocano beginning in their childhood. So at present, Ibatan of Babuyan Claro is considered a separate language from Ivatan of Batanes, but they're very similar, very close. Although Ibatan reflects many features not present in the Batanic languages of Batanes. So I will be talking about Ibatan as a lect in transition. So how it started as a separate language from the Batanic languages up to how it became a distinct language of its own. So the current Ibatan people is very interesting because it's a young community. So people, I think this is the third and fourth generation. So they actually know their ancestry. The major families can be traced to these major families here. So the current Ibatan people descend from this first family who were attempting to find their way back to Batanes further north. It was around 1869 that this happened. So this was a product of, if you know, of course you know the Spanish Reduction. So people from Batanes were relocated to mainland Luzon and the Babuyan Islands. I think the Lupiri or Camiguin, Babuyan Islands. And then this small family here, they were attempting to go back to Batanes, but then they were shipwrecked on the island. So that was what happened actually for many of the families. This family here was from an Ilocano speaking background. So yung gray ones were from Batanic ancestry and the pink ones were from Ilocano ancestry. So same thing, they got shipwrecked and got stranded on the island and started living there. So it was, during these early years, there was a preference to marry within one's own ethnolinguistic group. They kept the distinction separate. But the people needed to maintain social contact with each other because of the harsh conditions on the island. If you're familiar with the region, it's very tough conditions. Difficult agriculture, difficult fishing, monsoon season. So they needed to support each other, but in a limited capacity. Yung residential settlements before, during these early years, were very separate, scattered across the islands. But then, interestingly, because of this kind of situation, this resulted in the maintenance of bilingualism. So people kept their languages, Ibatan and Ilocano, and this must have facilitated the emergence of Ibatan as a separate language. So throughout the early years up to present of Babuyan Claro, Ilocano has been a major player in the development of Ibatan, not only as the main language in contact with Ibatan and the main source of contact-induced features of the language, but also in terms of vitality, where for a long time, Ibatan has been threatened by the position of Ilocano. So speakers, especially in around the 1970s, preferred to use Ilocano in most of their everyday life because of the status of Ilocano. And so the speakers were not learning Ibatan anymore until several social changes happened. So yung changes in the socio-political landscape of the community also reshapes its language ecology. First, there was the transfer of the village center originally from an Ilocano-speaking hamlet. So the residential settlements in Babuyan Claro, you can find certain patterns of language use among the people as well. So there were certain hamlets that are more Ilocano speaking, and then other hamlets are more Ibatan speaking. So the village center was transferred from an Ilocano speaking hamlet to an Ibatan speaking one around the 1980s, late 1980s. So there was also a shift in the dominant religion of the community. Originally, the people from Babuyan Claro were Catholics, but then missionaries came, and then Protestantism became the dominant religion after that. And it was this religion that drove the use of Ibatan actually in the religious activities. Ilocano was mainly used for Catholic na mga religious activities. In terms of education, originally, the teachers in Babuyan Claro were all Ilocano immigrants. But then, as the Ibatans became educated, there began, the increase of local Ibatan teachers. And now, actually, some Ilocano teachers have started using Ibatan when they're teaching children. So it actually depends on the teacher. If they're stubborn, they would use Ilocano and refuse to use Ibatan. But some teachers are actually very keen to learn Ibatan as their second language. So they use it when they teach. So finally, increased geographic mobility. So before, very rare yung traveling to and from the mainland because of the difficulties in crossing that channel. But now, I think with the improvements in technology, so yung travel became more frequent. People travel to and from Babuyan Claro more frequently. Students now go to Tuguegarao for schooling, for university. So they get more exposed to actually more languages, not just Ilocano, but in Tuguegarao, Filipino, and other Philippine languages. So all these recent shifts are reshaping the linguistic repertoires of the people of the island. So older generations report greater proficiency in Ilocano. Some are not at all comfortable in using Filipino when I talk to them. So, but for younger speakers, some are actually more comfortable in using Filipino now. So not in Ilocano anymore. So we see all these changes have contributed to the linguistic repertoires of the people. And then what I mentioned earlier about the residential settlements, social networks on the island also contribute to patterns of language use. And these networks roughly coincide with geographic boundaries. So if you know Ilocano, Daya, this is a borrowed word from Ilocano. Daya means east, and then Laod meaning west. These two regions refer to a small group of hamlets on the island. So what they call Laod or West refers to the predominantly Ilocano-speaking hamlets. So this was where the original village center was, and the main center of Ilocano dominant families. And then you can also find here ethnic Ibatans who have shifted to Ilocano or are shifting to Ilocano. And then Daya or East is the center of Ibatan dominant families. This is now the current village center, and yung Ilocano immigrants who live here are also quick to learn Ibatan. And now comparing Ibatan with its sister languages in the Batanic subgroup, the language is quite unique because it shows contact-induced features which are not present in the other Batanic languages. So in terms of lexicon, Ibatan is considered a high borrower with 43.67% of loan words versus the native vocabulary. This is quite high compared to the global pattern. So the global pattern is about like 25%. or something, if I remember correctly. In terms of structure, there are also a number of formatives in Ibatan that can be considered contact-induced, and some of these are traced to Ilokano. For example, for ordinals, meaning ordering, so who came first, for example, first or second. So Ibatan has two. You can choose either a Batanic structure, Chadadwa, meaning second, or Ilokano, May Kadwa. I think May Kadwa is now on the rise. I've heard this more frequently than the Batanic one. And then with pluralization, this is interesting because it depends on the etymology of the root. So if the root word is Batanic, ancestry like mabakas for woman, so bakas is woman, mababakas, so you have a CV reduplication, so bakas. But then with an Ilocano root, balasang, which means dalaga, maiden, you have to reduplicate the first consonant, vowel, and then the first consonant again. So balasang. So it depends on the etymology of the root word. Okay? So these are some of the examples of regularized contact-induced language change in Ibatan. In finding explanations for how these kinds of changes develop in a language, there are several factors that drive the direction of language change. It's not just language internal mechanisms, but it's also extralinguistic factors, the social linguistic context of the community, for example. And I'm following this framework by Mauschken 2010 that links a particular outcome to particular setting involving specific people with specific backgrounds. So he identifies different scenarios and aggregates for contact, ranging from the individual to the community to larger regions. So outcomes, linguistic outcomes, are always situated in their specific contexts. So this case study on Ivatan and Ilokano, because it's a young community, it concerns the first two aggregates that Mauschken has identified, so the individual and the community. So focusing on the individual, these are again very synchronic, very ongoing variant, so medyo walang pattern. But with the community, it's the regularized one. So this is considered more like a deeper aggregate or a deeper time depth. So it's also important to distinguish here two directions of change. So first, how non-native materials, for example, when you borrow a word, how it becomes adapted into the recipient language. So for example, in Filipino, you borrow, ano magandang word? Na maisip. For Filipino, for example, vase. So for those who are not really proficient in English, yung V becomes B because walang V, di ba, sa ano? So maging base. But at the same time, how these loan words or foreign influence can change the recipient language. So now, for example, in the past, Filipino doesn't have consonant clusters, crudo, ganyan, Christmas, braso, di ba? But with the influx of these loan words, it has changed the language. So now we allow clusters in our sound system. Okay. Braso, before baraso, diba? So you break the clusters. So may ganong distinction. So we see that language change is not always neat and synchronous. We see it actually reflects yung layers of change. So these layers of change can be linked to specific points in the history of the community. So this part of the presentation, I'm now going to the first aggregate of contact, the individual. This can be quite technical. So I'll just give a very quick definition of the different concepts. So dominance here, when I talk about dominance, it pertains to the relative proficiency and use of the bilingual of their different languages, not the socially dominant not in the social context, but psycholinguistic notion. So what's like your hand? What's the dominant hand, left or right? What's your dominant language? Filipino or English for others. So basically, native speakers are dominant in their native language. But one thing to note is that dominance can change within one's lifetime. So when you move, for example, as an immigrant, diba, you tend to change dominance in the language of where you're moving to. So parang ganun. So this can shift. And then this notion of dominance governs agentivity and transfer. So yung agentivity pertains to the individual's agentive language. It's typically the dominant language. So for individuals, sige, in recipient language agentivity, so yung recipient language, yung agentive language mo. The agentive language for the case of Babuyan Claro is Ibatan. And the Ibatan dominant speakers work on recipient language agentivity. But so this governs borrowing transfer, where materials from a source language, for example, Ilokano words, get borrowed or transferred into the recipient language, Ibatan. So parang ganun lang muna. That's how we look at this. For source language agentivity, so the agentive language of the speaker is Ilokano. So these are for Ilocano dominant speakers. So if you're an Ilocano immigrant learning Ibatan, so your agentive language is Ilocano. So this governs imposition transfer. So for example, yung Ilocano sounds or patterns gets imposed onto how speaker uses Ibatan. So to relate to our context, for example, when we borrow English words into Filipino as Filipino native speakers, that concerns recipient language agentivity, right? So we incorporate English words into our language. But then when we try to speak English, for example, so English is not our native language. So our sound patterns, syntax, ganyan, grammar becomes imposed onto how we speak English. So sometimes we use English with a Filipino accent, like how I sound. Sometimes we use Filipino grammar onto our English. So that's what you call source language agentivity. So all these relate to the stability gradient of language. So certain materials, certain linguistic materials are argued to have different levels of stability. So words are easy to borrow versus grammar. Kasi grammar, it's more stable. So that's actually what's difficult to let go. So when you talk in English, yung stable stuff in your mind, like sound system and grammatical patterns, these tend to stick around when you're learning a language. So lots of things to keep in mind. So I'll give you some examples so that we can imagine how it's happening in Babuyan Claro. First example concerns the loss of word final H. So in Ibatan, the language has H word finally. It's not common in Filipino. But for example, rako, for big, you can actually hear H here. So for an Ibatan dominant speaker, of course, that's normal. So let's hear this example.
Nakabit sa duyan ng asawa ko, akayo.
Rako, akayo. But then for a non-native speaker, so an Ilocano dominant speaker, Ilocano doesn't have H word finally. And so, for a non-dominant speaker, they tend to lose itong word final H. Ay.
Nabilo yung kapwa kayo.
Rakuha, kayo. For a native speaker, it should sound like rakuha, kayo versus rakuha, kayo. That's a very salient feature of how Ilocanos use Ibatan. We can also see intra-speaker variation. So this is like it doesn't mean that if you're an Ilocano speaker, you tend to lose all H. Variant pa rin yung change.
As iya ada yang pinatay doon ulo ngayon sa
So rakuwa, so without the word final H, but in other instances, the same speaker would use correctly. So for this case, she pronounces the word correctly. So therefore, change is not regular and it varies even within a single individual. And then there are cases of hypercorrection, meaning this person is a non-dominant speaker, but she's known in the community for her good Ibatan. But then she tends to overcompensate or hypercorrect. So if, in cases where you don't have word final H in the word, she tends to show that. Medyo mahina, naktah-tah, when it shouldn't have H in the first place. So I'll skip this, just another example, but this is actually a dominant speaker losing H. So it just shows that this change is actually ongoing, that speakers, even dominant ones, have started to pick up this change. But then H actually is kind of a weak sound. So it tends to get affected, tends to get lost even without the influence of Ilocano actually. So just to emphasize that change can be multi-causal. It can be the result of many different things, not just language contact. Now to move on to the domain of morphology, I'll just show you the use of two distinct affixes. So in Ibatan, you have parallel structures from Ilokano and Ibatan. So again, this is similar to what I discussed earlier. It depends on the etymology of the root. So for example, to sit is Batanic and you use the Batanic prefix. May disna, nay disna. But then if you use an Ilocano root, kalap, to fish, you use the Ilocano prefix. The Ilocano prefix is ag, but in Ibatan it's mag, magkalap, nagkalap. So may versus mag, nay versus nag. So in this example, this is an Ibatan dominant speaker. She uses the prefix correctly. Lobat na yata. So basically, what she's saying is, Naichichwas, naghang. Ayan. Naichichwas do yananaw no kayo. Naichichwas, correctly. But then for a non-dominant speaker, the same word, chichwas, she used the Ilocano prefix na chipag chichwas. This is considered an error for a native speaker. But for non-native speakers, that's just how they use their language. Parang grammatical error, but ayan. Another example is yung nga. Who knows Ilocano? Ayan, so nga is parang na in Tagalog. So dadwa nga, rako nga, basket. So two big baskets. And she uses the Ilocano particle. In Ibatan, it's meant to be a. Dadwa, rakuha, basket. But she uses the Ilocano form. Now, what's interesting here is that you can also hear this in fixed expression. So, normally, these are what you're memorizing, diba? Parang you memorize the whole thing. Like when you're talking in English, ganyan, you memorize an expression, good morning. So, fixed siya, but it's actually affected by language contact here. So, maganay nga, mahap, instead of maganay, mahap. So, it's interesting that even fixed expressions can get affected by language contact. So, all these examples are what we call the source language agentivity, imposition transfer. So Ilocano structures get imposed onto the speech of Ibatan, of the Ilocano speakers using Ibatan. So this essentially boils down to language dominance. As once dominance in Ibatan increases, these impositions tend to lessen in their speech. So parang when we talk in English, once our proficiency in English increases, our use of English becomes better, less yung effect ng Filipino onto our English. But it's not as simple as that. So language dominance is multidimensional. It's mediated by social linguistic parameters. How often are you exposed to the languages? How often do you use them? It's gradient. So there are varying degrees of dominance. It's dynamic. It can change in one's lifetime, and it can be domain or context specific. For example, I can say I'm dominant in English when I write, but when I speak, I'm more dominant in Filipino. So it's context specific. So it's the same in Ibatan. And all these are driven. So we have seen how individual or synchronic innovations are driven by psycholinguistic mechanisms. But these may not necessarily translate to population level change. So how do specific innovations among individuals get selected or picked up by the whole community? Think of like how a certain word gets popular in social media. How does that get popular? Who introduces a certain word? And why does it get picked up by the community? Like yung mga yarn or what else? Ano ba yung mga ngayon? Di ba ang dami ng language use? It's very dynamic, ang bilis mag-pick up. And under evolutionary frameworks for language change such as Croft, the propagation of change is said to be underpinned by selection mechanisms. And this is essentially driven by social factors. So in terms of contact-induced change, it's depending on social factors and intensity of contact. So how intense yung contact situation is, and then social factors such as social networks, the prestige of the languages, speaker choices, population structure can also influence what gets propagated across the community. So for Ibatan, I'll skip these very technical examples. And then I'll show siguro some of the stuff that's relatable to us. For example, yung B and V na variation. So in Ivatan of Batanes, they have the V consonant, but in Ibatan, that got lost completely. Everything became B. And it's argued to be the result of contact with Ilokano, which doesn't have V in its sound system. Now, another example is in the domain of yung what I mentioned about consonant clusters. So originally, yung mga Spanish loan words like padre became padi. So adapted into Ibatan because this became a single consonant kasi not allowed yung clusters in Ibatan. Troso became toroso, Christmas became Christmas. But then, with siguro the increase of loan words from Spanish and English, the clusters have now become part of Ibatan structure. So muestra, mostra, crude oil, crodo, and trabajo. Actually, trabajo has two forms. Tarabaco, which is argued to be the older form because of the lack of consonant clusters, but then younger speakers now prefer the use of trabajo. So it's the more recent one. So we see that older forms show heavier adaptation. Now in terms of morphology, like what I've discussed earlier, yung use of the two prefixes depending on the etymology of the stem. So there are cases of hybrid formation. So remember for what I showed earlier, so Ibatan prefix with Ibatan stem and then Ilokano prefix with Ilokano stems. But then there are cases of hybrid formations where a Batanic prefix is used with an Ilokano stem, and this is regardless of your language dominance. Parang even if you're a native speaker of Ibatan or an Ilocano native speaker, you use this, may bilag. And then Yeah, so typically it's complex loanword, combination of a non-native stem with non-native morphology. And then there are like other exceptions, and this is used across the community. For this one, it's the same stem but with different affixes. So mag-cuarto, Ilokano affix with a Spanish loanword, but you're also using Batanic prefix with the same loanword, but they appear to have different functions. So it's starting to develop in different ways. So there are also other exceptions. I'll just quickly go through them. Hybrid formations. So basically, the point of these examples here is that you can see layers of change in Ibatan. It's not neat. It's not like complex loanwords, Batanic, Ilokano. It's not. So you have to learn this. So may mga irregular forms. And this is used across the community. So we've seen examples of contact-induced outcomes both at the level of the individual and the community. And these changes can actually be linked to the specific phases in the history of the community. So based on historical, genealogical, and ethnographic records, I have identified distinct phases in the community. So 5 phases here. And then some of the changes we have seen can be linked to these 5 phases. So for example, fully adapted loanwords can be linked to the first families because they were very proficient in Ibatan and have less proficiency in Ilokano. So they adapted the Ilokano loanwords into Ibatan. However, with the increase in proficiency in Ilokano, the rise of Ilokano as a socially dominant language in the region, we also see different kinds of change. So more of source language agentivity. So Ilocano dominant speakers introducing that kind of change into Ibatan. So this is how we reconstruct the social linguistic history of the community. You link linguistic outcomes with the likely agents of change, who likely brought these changes into the language, and how this got picked up by the whole community. And there are various factors that can be argued to facilitate this, like what I've said, population structure. There should be enough people, for example, in the community who are non-dominant in Ibatan for this kind of change to happen. Yes, so we consider social factors in driving change. And there are certainly many other factors at play, and this is something that is yet to be fully explored. We don't know how exactly change transition from a single individual to the community. It's something that's very interesting to see. And for Babuyan Claro, change reflects the dynamic patterns of multilingualism. So we see the community as a very dynamic one, and so there are also very lots of changes that happened in Ibatan. And it's not yet clear how these multitude of factors interact to drive change. So there are psycholinguistic or cognitive mechanisms, but there are also social mechanisms that interact to drive change. In Babuyan Claro, we know that social networks play a big role. Marriage patterns, age and gender, these are some of the very salient factors that have been shown to drive language change. And I'd like to end with language ideology. And this greatly affects the use of Ibatan, specifically the layering of changes we saw in the presentation. Following Ruth Singer's work, I asked some of the speakers to color the picture in terms of how they view their ethnicity. So for this speaker, she is a dominant speaker of Ibatan. She colored the whole figure with red, representing how she sees herself as a pure Ibatan. And this is a common view among the Daya network, the Ibatan network. But then sorry, hindi malinaw, but this is from the Laod network, they colored the figures with a mix of blue and red, reflecting how they see themselves as mixed. And this is also seen in how they use their language. So Laod is known for Ilokano, meaning a mix of Ibatan and Ilokano. That's how the people from Babuyan Claro label them, Ibakano. And they also label themselves Ibakano. So this is directly related to how they use the two languages. And it's also common for Ilocano immigrants on the island. They don't see themselves as pure Ilocanos anymore. They're part Ibatan because they use Ibatan more frequently now. And I've also experienced this. People, when they see me, they would tell me, Ibatan ka na, because I can speak to them in Ibatan. So I'd like to end this this seminar with a video from one of my consultants. So what she's saying here reflects her increasing dominance in Ibatan. How ethnicity can be fluid for the speakers. Hindi ko ma-play yung video. But basically, she's saying, I'm thankful because ayan.
Di magyaman ako sa aral drama o ako di ko ma-appreciate. Kitsa mo rin kimaragsaman ako mo asagwa Ibatan ako. Kan may pagpanakil ko Ibatan ako. Na ikaw mga ako doon sa Ibatan.
So she's using Ibatan instead of Ilocano, her native language. She wanted to speak and learn Ibatan so that her children can be considered pure Ibatan. Asawa niyang Ibatan. Yes. So, yun lang for this presentation. Magyaman ako, Jinyo.
Hey, thank you for sharing your research for studying these languages. It's very interesting seeing the dynamics in the way that language is adopted and changes as, almost like a living thing.
Yes.
That's very interesting. So, with that, I'll open the floor up to questions.
That was the word we use for old settlement, the past settlement, called ED, right?
Idi.
ED. Because I was excavating inside the Batanic, called Nakuha ED, the large settlement. So ED is actual at the Batan language, but it is referred to an old Ilocano settlement. So from what they see, it's not a self-prescribed word. It is a word that the Ibatans call them. Am I correct in that? So if you're Ilocano, I would call it an Ilocano word, but ED is an Ilocano word. So the prescription is not self-prescribed, it's other prescribed. Or the Ibatan prescribed word to call the place an old site, but in the Ibatan language.
I think so.
But ED is Batanic.
Idi, Ili.
But when you go to Cagayan and to Cordilleran and Ilocos, it's Ili.
Ili.
I-L-I.
So,
Iba kasi yung pilihan. ED kasi, nakuha ED, in Ibatan is settlement.
village.
Nakuha ED, nakuha ED, it is a large settlement. As an old settlement in Ibatan is nakabahayan. So ED is a settlement, Naku is large. So large settlement. So ED, that's not ED, it's ED. Right?
Yeah.
So it's Ibatan.
Yes, that's so Ma'am Grace's example, that shows exactly that ED is Batanic. Because if it's Ilocano, it should be Ili. But then in Babuyan Claro, the village center previously was ED. So that's a Batanic word. But that was also where the Ilocanos used to live. So that Laod region. So
It's not a self-prescribed.
yes, others. So, but place names can be interesting actually in Babuyan Claro. Some are Ilocano, from Ilocano, and some were from Batanic na etymology. So for example, Rakwaksong, big river, that's very Batanic. Rako is big, river is Oksong, that's Batanic. But then if you look at the sound changes, it can be a bit Ilokano because for Batanic it should be Rakoha Oksong. But yung H got lost, Rakwaksong. So parang may dynamics pa rin how Ilocano can still influence yung language. Other place names like Naidi. So Naidi was, I think, the original village center. Pero before the rise of Ilocano pa, and that's now a bit depopulated, parang one family na. So Naidi, very Batanic din, transferred to Idi, and then became a different village center. So meron pang mga places like Pukis, yung bundok, na very Ilocano. So ayun, may dynamics who gets to name the place.
Several things. How different, I know it's not part of your research, but perhaps you also considered it at one point. How different is the Ilocano spoken there compared to the Ilocano spoken in the mainland?
The thing is, Ilocano has different varieties pa rin. So, yung Ilocano, for example, of Ilocos, different from, even Ilocos Norte and Sur, can be different from Cagayan. And then the Babuyan Islands, and then Babuyan Claro.
There, was it a choice? Or
Choice.
Pero later on, active migration.
So before, yung first families, it happened by accident, right? So some of the families from the Babuyan group of islands just parang na shipwreck.
In the 1860s, no one was living there. It was uninhabited.
It was actually inhabited before. So there was an original population on Babuyan Claro. But the island got completely depopulated, first because of a volcanic eruption. It's a volcanic island. I think 2 major volcanoes there. And then because of Spanish reduction. Now when the new families came to Babuyan Claro, the island was completely depopulated, but they found remains or parang evidence of previous settlements. They thought it was, the spirits or their ancestors. But no one actually knew or knows until now the ancestry of this original population. Could have been Batanic or Ilocano. No, but they were yung mga ang-angs, yung urns. So burial jars. So there were lots of burial jars that were recovered in Babuyan Claro. So there was an original population.
Like the ones you find in Batanic.
Not certain how, baka kasi yung madaling mabulok. So it was just the burial sites that were discovered.
So the population, so of course the question is very archaeological. So the population now, they don't see any connection with this jar area.
No. Separate.
So how is it protected? How is it treated? Side protection?
Wala. I haven't even seen yung So I think it was dug up before, but when I was there, I haven't seen like any traces of these
And how
burial
do you
jars.
get there?
So, ayan, ito na. This is the exciting part. So, from Manila, you go to Tuguegarao, and then you take a van to Santa Ana, the tip of northern Luzon, and then you have to know people. So you take there are no commercial boats going to Babuyan Claro. You either go to Calayan and wait for a boat, or you can, if you know people, you can ride a fishing boat to the island. It takes about 9 hours of boat ride on a good day. So Amihan, it's impossible to get there from November to March. So good season is April to 4.
And when you say fishing boat, how big is it?
Nandito ba yung ah, parang 10. Good for 10 people. Very small.
Oh, these are all bigger.
Outrigger, something
No, what else is going on?
something like this.
9 hours.
9 hours. Now 9 hours papunta, pag pauwi, more than kasi counter current. So 10 plus. To Kalayat. To Babuyan Claro. No?
According to Malayan,
You can also take that, yes.
So how are the products? How do they import?
So fishermen, walang commercial boats but they're regular fishing boats because so one of their main livelihoods is fishing. So they trade. So go to to Santa Ana to transfer their fish or get their supplies, and then these fishermen bring back yung supplies to the island. So COVID pandemic, that was very difficult for them. Kasi naka-lockdown. So it was only fishermen who could travel.
Rate of disappearances. What is the rate of
Disappearances by like sea accidents, ganyan. Very frequent. So for my field work, I collected stories. Parang, just tell me something that's interesting that happened in your life. And mostly fishing, sea accidents. Ganyan, people getting lost at sea for several days. Some have been to Taiwan. Actually, before, it was a very recent thing. Marami sa kanila yung nagta-Taiwan before when it was a bit, less strict pa. Daming Taiwanese fishermen then who came to the island to fish. Very interesting place, actually. Yes.
My question goes with ignorance. But, so that the deep roots of the Ibatan could be traced back to Ilokano or to Formosa? The deep roots of the language Ibatan are more akin to Formosa, Taiwan, or to all languages there, or to mainland Luzon.
Linguistically, almost all Philippine languages can be traced to Taiwan. So the similarities are there. But maybe if you look at the really close relationships, Ibatan is still closer to Ilokano than it is with the Formosan languages of Taiwan. So there's a common history between Ibatan and the rest of the Philippine languages compared to Formosan languages, which can be their sisters but they're very distant relatives.
And the input of Spanish in Ibatan could be similar to the input of Spanish in Ilocano. Similar.
Actually, interesting because most likely the Spanish influence in Ibatan came indirectly through Ilocano. So all the Spanish influence, most of the Spanish influence came through Ilocano because there was very limited or not at all, no direct connection between the Spanish and the Ibatans.
so you talk about the language dynamics, and you're opposing dialectic language. Two possibilities, right? Either one become more dominant than the other, or does it emerge a new language?
Yes.
Ibatan and Ilocano.
Yeah.
To what trajectory do you see it going?
Now it's still, Ibatan as a language descended from the Batanic subgroup with lots of Ilocano influence. It's a different thing when you talk about convergence in a sense like Chavacano, which is really like a hybrid of Philippine language and Spanish. But because the Ibatan speakers are kind of proud now at present. I don't know if this will still happen in the future, but they're proud of their ethnicity. They're happy to use their language, learn their language, pass it on to younger generation. So what I can see is that Ibatan will be maintained, but still with lots of influence from Ilokano. So it's something like Filipino. It's not like Filipino would change into like a hybrid of Filipino and English, but we see that it's Filipino will still get a lot of influence from English, mostly lexicon, but who knows?
How did you choose? What made you choose this island? Of all the 7,000
Ma'am Grace knows my history because she was one of my panel members. She was panel member during my MA in linguistics. So I started with a very wide interest on the Batanic languages. So I looked at the different Batanic languages. And when I was looking at my data, I kept seeing Ibatan as something very unique among the group. Really, it shows a lot of influence from Ilokano, which you can't see in the other Batanic languages. So I thought, okay, might be good to focus on this for my PhD because it's something also that can be observed in different Philippine languages and maybe even historically, diba? Yung influence of contact on the language, how one language would influence another. So I thought, okay, focusing on this case study, maybe I can say something or know something about the history of the deeper history by seeing how it's happening at this time depth. But maybe we can infer deeper time depth from my findings.
The last question. In terms of relationship, it has always been peaceful between the Ilocanos and the
No, not really actually. In the past, sort of, it was a bit egalitarian in the past, during the early years of the community. But then, with the changes in the region, Ilocano became more dominant socially. And then in the past, the Ibatans used to go to school in Calayan because there were no parang hanggang grade 5, only yung school sa Babuyan Claro. So, at a young age, you have to go to Calayan, away from your family, and that's where they experience bullying because of their ethnicity. They speak a different language, people would make fun of them. So, it was kind of a tough experience for some of the Ibatans during that time. But then with the changes, now the Ibatans can take up to senior high school on Babuyan Claro. So less experiences, less negative experiences. And then they can go to Tuguegarao for college. And Tuguegarao is more diverse, so they don't really experience the same kinds of negative experiences that the older generations have experienced. And even with the sa Certificate of Ancestral Domain, because they got awarded that title recently, so they have complete and exclusive rights to the island and the sea. It's the first community that has exclusive rights to the sea. But the sea is very rich, diba? Yung region is very rich. Ilocanos used to come there to fish as well, but now they're not allowed. So, of course, there would be conflicts.
So when you started your research, you don't need to go to SIP.
Because I got permission from the community, so the community backed me up, and then that was enough for NCIP.
But now because they've been awarded the ancestral domain, it's a must that you should go to SIP.
So I did, but already with the consent from the community. So I filed my paperwork with NCIP as well.
But good for either archaeology.
Yes. It's very important for those that are interested in research.
This is very fun.
Oh, yes, yes, yes.
Walang internet sa Babuyan. Walang mobile signal, but there's very limited internet. Satellite, but very slow. But they can still access social media. So it's also interesting. Sometimes they would prefer actually Filipino because that's for wider audience. Depends who the audience is. They would use Ibatan, for example, for private stuff, like community or family topics, but then Filipino actually for most of the time.
Pero like yung mga social media languages or threads yung na all nagagamit ba nila?
Oo naman. Oo, meron pa rin. For youth. For the younger generation.
Okay, how long was your field or how long did you do?
So first, did my scoping trip for 1 week, and then one of my main field trips, 2 months on the island, and then 1 month with Ibatans in Tuguegarao. And then I got stranded noong 2020. I was meant to go to Babuyan Claro, but I couldn't, so I was stuck here. But then in 2022, last year, I was able to do some field work for 1 month.
Okay. Yeah, we are coming up on time, so I'd like to thank again our speaker for today. And I'm sure if you have any other questions, she'd be more than glad to answer them if they come at a later date. So, with that being said, let me just announce next week's BINALOT talk, which is by our visiting scholar, Jordan Winters, of that. Where she will be speaking, the title of her talk is The Voyagers of Malacay, if I'm saying that right. Experimental and public archaeology in the living Malacayos. If I'm saying that right. Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.